Hello, thanks for tuning in again. Going to continue on with Susan MeeLing's, that's me, Reverend Susan MeeLing, modern day book, because I wrote it. So last particular video ended around the 32, 33 mark, and so just before the 32, 33 mark. So I'm going to continue from page 32 on to 33. If the treasonous actions of civilians with no military records or service connection of, however, if there is a dependent status to the United States of America's Armed Forces, various branches or divisions of within said labeled individuals, then the considerations for such recommendations are as follows. 1. The option of which the harvesting of organs for others to live, as well as the donation of plasma and blood if healthy enough and without communicable diseases which cannot be cleaned out. However, if not, then option 2 of death by firing squad as per UCMJ or Universal Code of Military Justice Regulations. Or 3, the volunteering to be a willing guinea pig for the medical community for drug usages in the case of finding a cure, and thus to whichever companies who are attempting to already work on such medications to prevent soldiers and law enforcement from having to be a part of their initial test trials, the way they have been over the years. While admittedly a bit upsetting to some, specifically cherubim ones, it was completely understandable and is completely understandable. As I guesstimate, certain techie guys, as I call them, are quite thankful because Best Buy made the decision for that time in reference to what happened in Washington State of that accidental warranty plan issue. So one could estimate for 1 or 2 e-cigarettes or e-cigarette batteries, of which I've had to purchase, would be the equivalent of at least 1 laptop, which would have needed to be replaced while I was in Washington State for a short amount of time. Since the guesstimation, in order to make a FISA and FOIA request, there needs to be a legal basis for the inquiry and the legal aspects brought to the attention of the United States of America's government for any FISA request. I pose these hypothetical points. 1. If hypothetically such in regards to a single and or set of FISA requests had been made because of my choice to click of all the boxes on the Amazon website to maximize profits in reference to my books, because my choice to want to make the aspects of what I experienced available to the world to show my lack of biases and as well as my own comprehension, there were others who had similar situations to mine in the first books that I wrote, in some ways of which, admittedly and thankfully for them, they had not suffered in all of the ways that I had. Thus, in my good intentions to attempt to assist better through helping people around the world, to show certain aspects are not limited, but can assist to find common ground to work better together between countries so the world can genuinely be a safer place and governments can better work with the understanding of the United States of America's political elected figures. It is my hope such was understood, as my intent was to assist procedures all across the board in respects of personal aspects, whereas when before there were just an availability of the internet, the personal lifestyles were more available and able to be hidden from view. However, now in this era, the availability of information is far more broad, and thus in the overall, the assist to help those within the United States of America's government, as well as the treated countries. I would also like to be able to hope people who once knew me would know better of my intentions to assist the overall for safety of all law enforcement and military officials of the United States of America, especially when traveling overseas. Though I have a feeling that could be considered wishful thinking on my part in certain regards to ones I once knew, such as my ex-in-laws, and, the Jade Wolf Coven and my biological immediate family, for a few examples. And if such occurred regarding FOIA, FISA, and etc. type of law requests. I hope my actions have proven my equality and balance in my words of good and peacefully balanced intentions. Undeniably, though I am a Republican who independently thinks for myself in this democratic republic we call the United States of America, with the liberties of the Constitutional Bill of Rights, which each who has signed the dotted line and has taken the oath to do and pay those bills, keep such availabilities of which more civilians who enjoy such, in my opinion, should be far more appreciative thereof. If they're in number 2, if hypothetically a set of FOIA and FISA requests, etc., of which the legal basis had been because of false claims against me and or lies spread to the United States of America's government due to those people, or as I call them, cherubim ones, personal opinions without any bias or proof, but only in bias, were using the government's resources to attempt to make situations worse than they already were for me, as well as my children. Though there are plenty who I would guesstimate would agree, I have had more than my fair share of hardships in my life, and if there were those cherubim ones who were trying to make my life even more difficult because of their own personal insecurities while ignoring the realities I had told them in person of, as well as online, that I was dealing with, but instead their intent had been because of their lack of willingness to see reality before their own eyes when I knew them, of which it was done by those in order to avoid the purchasing of the 2 first books I wrote in reference to those FISA and FOIA requests. Then I wonder if they spent more money through the lawyers and their time to do such requests rather than to simply legally purchase the books. And or if, in the example of Rebecca Schrader, had sent someone or had herself traveled to where I was to get a copy for herself of which she wrote to be spiteful. My question here is, was that more expensive for the lawyer fees and taking the oath to tell the truth, to avoid perjury, not to pay for the books in attempts to show the particular hatred of me, as well as my children, or was it less expensive to just purchase the books yourself? As well as traveling, because there was a female named Rebecca Schrader that I had met at a comedy club the night or the week of that had an open mic in Seattle, Washington, named Rebecca Schrader. Met with coffee with her at a shop in Aliki Beach. Is the purchase of my first 2 books, Finding a Silver Lining by Susan MeeLing and Finding the Silver Lining by Susan MeeLing, more or less expensive than a plane ticket or the gas it would take to fill up the car plus those fees that would be calculated? Probably less expensive to purchase the books. My recommendations in regards to if such occurred would be the charges of which stalking are concerned for such crimes, though if the utilization of technology had also been for such occurrences, then my recommendation would be a minimal of triple the minimum charges for such a type of crime. Due to the fact, because of Rebecca Schrader, Marcy Creemans, and Sarah or Kim Brown, whatever her last name is, first name, irresponsibility, because McCoy Elementary School would have that information, when being in charge to watch over 6 or 9 children in combination went on the field trip at the Fort Worth Zoo in 2010 for the McCoy Elementary School of Carrollton, Texas, and that number includes my daughter, legally had to give me paperwork, and instead of going through the lawyers for Carrollton Farmers Branch Independent School District, chose to attack my children and I further because of their own adult inadequacies, then the recommendation I give for legal penalties would be a multiplication of 5 per individual count of breaking such laws in reference to me, and that includes my children. However, because my children were minors when such occurred, when the criminal punishments of recommendations would be a multitude of 7 because of crossing over state lines in the United States of America. Though also taking into consideration, because of that head injury on Palm Sunday in 2000, and essentially being reborn and having to be retaught colors, would that hypothetically make me a minor as well, and thus a total of 3 minors for each cherubim wolf. My choice of the number to multiply of 5 is due to the fact of my medical retirement from the United States of America's Armed Forces, and the fact of choosing to attack my children, as well as I and my Medal of Honor art project, because of their personal shown disdain for the military of the United States of America. They and their associates thereof, who are civilians, it is my recommendation of what I have previously stated. However, if there are prior military and or law enforcement associations of or to the United States of America's Armed Forces of the branches and divisions, then the recommendations in regards to IRR, or Individual Ready Reserve, seem legitimate to make a legal argument in reference to the Universal Code of Military Justice, also known as the UCMJ. And yes, in the UCMJ, treason is considered as a punishable death by firing squad. Thus, if they are of dependent status or ever were of dependent status, whether they were a spouse or a child of, by technicalities, such could be argued in a legal court of law that those dependents and spouses, though not directly signing to be a part of the United States of America's Armed Forces, law enforcement, etc., they are an extension of. And if on a dependent ID card, similarly to an active duty, National Guard, Reserve, and Veteran ID card from the United States of America's Armed Forces, whichever branch, if such states that it is property of the United States government, as I wrote in my recent blog, then that, or journal blog, then that technically would mean that the dependents of the individual who part of the United States of America's Armed Forces, in turn would be property of the United States government, and by technicalities could be considered as property of, as well as able to be pulled forward under the UCMJ guidelines. That also extends to anybody who had ever been in or a part of the Reserve Officer Training Corps. So if they got an ID to be a part of the ROTC group, then in turn they could be called in on IRR, I would guesstimate, could legally be argued. It would make sense to me, at least. Speaking of, though the UCMJ, Universal Code of Military Justice, has within the laws and regulations to the penalty of death by firing squad, by those words, by the way, and though such has not been utilized for treason against the United States of America before in reference to the term of domestic terrorism, which is the epitome, in my opinion, of a treasonous act against the United States of America, and honestly, even more so than the actions chosen by those who were involved with the 151 Road Warriors event, or Titty Baby Road Warriors, because simply due to the fact of the crossing multiple state lines in conjunction, of utilizing hacking methods through the technology, as well as stalking and harassment in combination, whereas not to delegitimize such from those events from the Fiesta San Antonio, Texas event, but to give a contrast example thereof. Though personally both events I think could be labeled and classified under the broader spectrum of the label for domestic terrorism, as I also believe many could and or would agree with me for such, there are different levels of criminal activity for many aspects, and thus those two parallels can give a baseline for that reference. If there was a hypothetical lying to the United States of America's government by others, I have the question of, was the choice to not have purchased the books I wrote, of which she, meaning Rebecca Schrader, and those like her were to read on your own, more or less important at the time of which in opening was to point to the donation of finances to profit to the Tamarisi family, and thus including such biases against the United States of America's armed forces, though in specific through the Marine Corps, and thus showing further biases against such because of the prevention of the sales of my books, Finding a Silver Lining by Susan MeeLing, as well as Finding the Silver Lining by Susan MeeLing, to assist the health and welfare thereof, for also what he had endured, as in Andrew Tamarisi. Then the question is able to be arisen of, was the inevitable reality of going to jail or prison for lying to the government worth it for such individuals and their biases for? Hypothetically, if they've continued, apparently it was and is worth it to them to go to prison. Though I comprehend the aspects in reference to groups and individuals regarding the House of Congress and the House of Senate, however, in reference to the civilian personnel of the likes which Cactus Jack, aka Jeffrey Kirkendall Jr., and those associated with him, and or those 3 females previously named, and or the individuals of the BDSM LGBTQP swinger pagan communities I once had known, to prevent such, and thus reinforcing the biases of which I had been told of either about and or to my face in their actions and opinions. Therein I return to my points in regards to the criminal penalties thereof in reference to the multiplication of the standard views for such criminal penalties. Since I know the sanctuary in Dallas, Texas, as well as other locations I once attended events at, are or were closed down at some point, thus I can guesstimate the law enforcement agencies of the state of Texas, as well as the United States of America's larger body governing agencies, had found such to be true in reference to the criminal penalties. What they were in specific, I don't know. Of which I do apologize to those who were innocently affected, but were able to be saved from the continuation of the criminal penalties. I cannot apologize for those being saved from. I cannot apologize for the adversaries among. In turn, if such individuals had also joined onto the bandwagon proverbially to assist with the stalking and or harassing and or problems caused to my Medal of Honor art project across state lines outside of the state of Texas, and through the various locations of the cities and states I had been in during those times, and because my son, who was a minor at such times, being impacted as well, not forgetting my daughter, not forgetting all of the books that I wrote at that time, the same penalty aspects of the multiplication for such in reference only to the number of which has been written about. As legal professionals know, there are multiple points of which the laws have various sections and subsections, and thus that is only one of. And if my other books that I wrote, all before and in the year of 2016, were used without my consent, because I personally have not given my consent for such, then there are those legal penalties as well. Three, in turn to continue from the other questions of that hypothetical set of scenarios, make those individuals feel better or worse in their attempts to know and comprehend the truth of that I am God by prophetic means, and proof of as well as the hypothetical circumstances, and thus did such make their egos feel better or worse when lying to the United States of America's government, as well as the people who once trusted those cherubim ones. Did those individuals truthfully think telling such to the officials to check into me and surveil my actions, their actions too would be researched and scrutinized just as equally and just as much, would be investigated into their pasts and presents as would mine when filing such paperwork? Did those cherubim ones think going to the officials of the United States of America's government, if they only pointed at my life and my experiences, of which they only saw a portion of, their own actions, words, and deeds would be ignored? As the United States of America government went to look into their accusations of me? Because, I don't know, I don't think it takes a head injury to figure out, if you contact law enforcement, They tend to do research. I think that there's a job called being a detective. I'm fairly certain. I could be wrong, but I think that the term detective has been around for a while. And if I'm accurate on that, that would mean I don't think it should take a head injury to figure out that if you go and contact the government of the United States of America about an accusation, unlike in the civilian sector, a lot more times than not, law enforcement is going to research all sides of that equation. I don't think it took a head injury to figure that out, but I could be wrong. If such is true, why would they be arrogant enough to think such would not affect their pasts also in reference to being investigated? For example, if my ex-sisters-in-laws contacted officials and complained about me, did they think just because they are normal looking and considered pretty before the officials of the United States of America's government would choose which way to process that information just because they look normal and pretty in comparison to what I look like? Another example is if Cactus Jack, also known as Jeffrey Kirkendall Jr., would have contacted the government officials of the United States of America, did he and or the rest of his 151 road warriors, did he think that they would not find the court case and the documents in the San Antonio court system of his arrest and or look into the aspects of his time in Reserve Officer Training Corps? And I'm going to add, before turning the page, or as turning the page, if his brother Jeremy Kirkendall had not told the United States of America's armed forces about that arrest before going in as an officer, which is considered higher ranking than an enlisted soldier, did that guy not think that anybody would ever be able to find such information? If that particular individual, Jeremy Kirkendall Jr., did not disclose to the United States of America's armed forces of the Army branch that he said that he was joining, and when my book came out, they, as in the Army, had chosen to look into research into that and found that he had been arrested but did not disclose that information to the United States of America's armed forces, that would automatically mean that he would be kicked out of the United States of America's armed forces Army branch if he was not willing to participate, to help, and to assist in the criminal investigations against his brother and the other 151 Titty Baby Road Warriors. So if he is still a part of the Army, Jeffrey Kirkendall Jr., a.k.a. Cactus Jack, and Jamie Robles, a.k.a. Lazy Eye, you got something to worry about. Also, that includes anyone who chose to stay associated with such. For example, my biological parents and my biological sister chose Cactus Jack just as they chose my dead ex-husband over me, their daughter. You know, because Patricia, my biological sister, looks so much prettier and so much more normal than I do. But even before my hair being this way and before my tattoos, my biological parents and my biological sister had denounced me many times over. 2 side notes. Hopefully, first, there was a little bit of good which came through the cracks to assist the United States of America's armed forces and law enforcement whenever they figured out those people, also known as the cherubim ones, were lying to them as to how they were able to remain calm and cool under that type of pressure is beyond my understanding. And secondly, had any of those individuals, also known as cherubim ones, ever thought officials of the United States of America have seen how others have attempted to use their good nature to try to use against them, and thus they would do extra research to verify both sides, or however many sides possible, to ensure the lack of waste of government spending and funding. Am I the only person who understands the need for taxes being paid but does not want to have to pay taxes for wasteful spending, and thus could see and comprehend the government would do everything possible to ensure the prevention of waste in regards to legal prosecutions because of how much a lawyer makes per hour, while also keeping in mind the legwork, the amount of individuals, the travel expenses, the housing, and etc. per agency of involved, with whichever research had to be done to ensure the correct individual or individuals were brought to the courts of justice? Or am I wrong and lawyers no longer charge a fee over beginning at 3 digits per hour, while not forgetting the retainer fees of usually starting at 4 digits, but can be much larger than 5 or even 8 digits for a retainer fee? And if so, am I the only one who comprehends there are law firms of which the retainer fees are more than 7 digits, and that does not include the per hour fee of over 5 digits for each lawyer individually, as well as their paralegals, as well as their secretaries per phone call to get the other individuals on the phone line to speak with the lawyers of the firms with a 7 or higher digit retainer fee, and etc. With the amount of time and energy that those cherubim ones, as I call them, had put into such, hypothetically, where else could they have better put to use of their energy, and why instead did they choose such, instead of being better and helping and or better use of their time and energy? Do they comprehend they cannot get back that time, nor are they able to undo what they started? Do they, as those cherubim ones, as I call them, comprehend if they legally and hypothetically had began an investigation, or illegally but hypothetically began an investigation through the FISA, FOIA, and other courts, that they caused the United States of America's government to use time and resources, and the government found evidences of abuses of power and wasting of resources in the United States of America's government, is legally obliged to follow through with such endeavors, and thus they themselves, as those cherubim ones, made themselves a target for all of those investigations. If the people I once knew did not know I had sent all of my books to various businesses and media organizations after registering with the Library of Congress to try to hypothetically get help, if the people I once knew did not know that I had sent all of my books to the various businesses and media organizations after having submitted the information to the Library of Congress to get help for such after their hypothetical FISA or FOIA requests were made, or contacting Congress or Senate in their own state, for example, Mary Evangelina Nichols Osteen, my ex-sister-in-law, did they and those cherubim ones ever have any questions of which they had to testify in court about? Were they honest in every single aspect of their testimony? And if they were not, and hypothetically lied to those courts of which they testified, whenever and wherever they had to go as they did, what are the legal ramifications for lying when under oath? I would guesstimate when they signed some paperwork, they were told some of those. Did those cherubim ones know of which aspects of perjury are punishable in a court of law when lying to and in a court of law, and or when making a statement to an officer of the law for the United States of America? If they did know and were told of such, as I think does have to be explained to people when they make a report to law enforcement, did they ever before now, on the first day of the new year of 2020, in the month of January, when I was writing, on the first to the officials to the United States of America's government would prosecute them if they did anything wrong after they made their complaints as well. So if they had lied to law enforcement officers and then again after lying went to then commit more crimes, did those individuals, also known as cherubim ones, did they not think about the fact they too would be watched for everything they did and said, just as they may have hypothetically requested to be done to me in reference to the United States of America's government? So, you can go to Amazon order my book, I'll put the link down in the bottom. Please subscribe to my channel. And I'll be going over some more of the book, because apparently this whole coronavirus has everybody being quarantined, self-quarantined or not. So I'm going to have a lot of time to do all these videos. Thank you very much and have a good day.